I'm Renee Richard, and over the last few weeks with this new series of Roots of Faith, we've been visiting holy places and we've been showcasing holy people who have worked, lived, or visited the state in this area. And today we're going to take a little bit different take on it because you can see I'm in a cemetery. But to me, cemeteries are holy places. They're where our dead are buried. I walk in, there's a sense of reverence and respect. You know, when I'm near my grandparents, I talk to them when I'm in the cemetery. So it's worthy of a show. And not only that, but if you think about it, there are thousands of people buried in these cemeteries that are known in their holiness only to God alone. And so we want to bring that to you, and we'll be talking about some of the people we do know that are buried here, some of the unusual tombs. So join us on this episode of Roots of Faith. We're here in Magnolia Cemetery, one of the downtown Baton Rouge cemeteries that we're going to be talking about today. And I have as my guest Chip Landry. Chip is a retired lieutenant with the East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Office, but he's also the sexton at St. Joseph Cemetery. And he's also the chairman of the Board of Trustees for Magnolia Cemetery here. And longtime volunteer in the archives. He and I go back many years. And so today we'll be discussing some of these cemeteries. So Baton Rouge had its start, when you think about it, you know, it was founded up by the river where the fort was. So probably, you know, the first cemeteries we know are up in that area. And we'll be talking about more of the ones here in downtown. But tell us a little of the history of the cemeteries and burial practices in the, you know, in those early years.
Well, originally with the early settlers, there was no dedicated cemetery. They were just buried in a spot that was convenient for them. The first cemetery that I'm aware of was up behind the area where the new state capitol is, and it was next to an early chapel, a building that was used for church services. In 1792, King Carlos of Spain mandated, since this was under Spanish control, that a Catholic church be established along with a cemetery. And the church was in the general area where the cathedral is now. The cemetery was on what's now North Street between 4th and 5th Street. And that served the community for a number of years. In the early 1820s, the town fathers of Baton Rouge passed a resolution asking the church not to bury anybody else in that Spanish cemetery because the odor was overpowering the town. The people in Spanish Town used to let their livestock graze in there, and they broke into some of the graves and things along those lines. So the church immediately began looking for a new location, and they finally settled on a spot which is now in the 1600 block of North Street, and began moving the people from the old Spanish cemetery to the new cemetery.
So that was about the 1820s,
That
late
was,
1820s?
The cemetery actually opened 1825.
Okay, and you're talking about St. Joseph right now?
St. Joseph's Catholic Cemetery.
Okay.
In 1825, they began moving the remains from the old Spanish cemetery and moved them over to the new cemetery, and that's where all the new burials took place.
Now, what about, I do know that at one time that there was a cemetery for Protestants, Americans, war people. Wasn't that around where the Capitol is?
Yes. In order to be buried at St. Joseph, you had to be a Catholic. So there was no organized burial space in Baton Rouge for non-Catholics. So the U.S. garrison and Ordnance Depot, where the Capitol grounds are now, allowed the townspeople to bury in their cemetery. And through the years, it was known as the Garrison Cemetery, the American Cemetery, and the Protestant Cemetery. When they closed that cemetery in the 1880s, a lot of the military people were moved to the National Cemetery, which is across the street here. But that cemetery was located on the east side of the Arsenal Museum in that flat area. The officers were buried in the Indian Mound, what we know today as Cannon Hill.
Okay.
And so that was the Protestant burial grounds for a long time.
Okay. So we're in Magnolia Cemetery, which was the Baton Rouge Cemetery, correct? And I think what people don't understand is, like, right now we're in the heart of Baton Rouge. I've got Sacred Heart behind me, but this was considered behind town. I mean, it was a considerable walk. It was Baton Rouge itself was located just along the river, correct, in the 1800s. We didn't really start growing until Exxon, Coca-Cola, and some of these other things came around 1900. So it was behind town. How did it have its origins here?
This was the western edge of John Christian Bueller's plantation, and prior to the city purchasing it, he had allowed people to bury on this end of his plantation, and when the city decided they needed a city cemetery, they purchased this property from Bueller's and established Magnolia Cemetery, because at the time of the establishment, it was full of magnolia trees. You've really got to search now to find any of them in here. So as you walk through the cemetery, you will find headstones that predate the 1852 purchase date. And what happened is, once this cemetery was established, people who had buried in their family cemeteries and on their plantations began moving their loved ones into the city-owned cemetery.
Okay. And that's continued. So you might see an earlier headstone, but
Right.
as Baton Rouge grew, and these properties were being sold off, so they may have been brought here, at a later date,
Yes.
but the headstone reflects an earlier date.
Yes.
And some of those family cemeteries still exist in Baton Rouge, such as the Knox Cemetery over on South Harrell's Ferry, the O'Neill family,
is on South
which
Harrell's
O'Neill
Ferry.
Lane is named
Right.
after on South Harrell's Ferry. So in different parts of town, there's still some family cemeteries on what was family properties, because that was characteristics of the time, correct?
Exactly.
So
you buried them close to home because travel was so difficult back in those days.
that's it. Now this is what, it was about a 16 acres that they purchased, or is it 16 acres now or something in that ballpark, or do you even know? I read that in a book.
Yeah, it's
Roughly?
10 plus acres.
Okay,
roughly.
of this part. So the 16 may have included the National at one time when it was first purchased. It doesn't matter.
No.
I'm looking
Yeah.
at it, and folks, when you come out here, it's a nice sized cemetery. So, tell us about some of the notable people.
Well, when you walk through here, you see
I have one in particular,
the early history of Baton Rouge.
no doubt.
The Manship family is buried here. Ravenhorse is buried here. At one time, Dr. Titchener, who was the developer of Hadacol.
No,
No, I'm
LeBlanc
sorry.
was
Yeah,
Dr. Titchener's.
Dr. Titchener's.
Which I was raised on by my grandpa.
Yeah. And don't ever use today's straight out of the bottle diluted.
It was that way as a kid.
But he was buried here originally. He was moved to Roselawn when it opened. Let's see, who else?
Is this the cemetery too that has the Crenshaw?
Yes,
tomb?
the Crenshaw.
Because he was a minister here as well. So a
Yes.
faithful of another faith buried here. But tell us a little bit about that tomb, because it's fascinating what's there.
Mr. Crenshaw was a Methodist minister, and in the late 1840s, early 1850s, 4 of his children died. And there is a monument, a marble monument over the graves there that actually has the first 3 that died, has their likenesses in marble statues on the monument. And also a younger one died, was not named, but he is mentioned on the marker.
Yeah, and what's sad about that, oh, I'm sorry, I
Go
thought
ahead.
you were done. What was sad about that when I was researching it too is that the 3 older children all died at the same time of yellow fever.
Yeah.
So the impact to that family, the loss of their whole family. But it's a very interesting one to see, that is here when you do see it.
Yes.
Anyone else of notable
Well, we
that you want to
have
mention?
Captain Edward York, who was a military engineer that assisted in and actually built lighthouses. He built the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse in Florida, which is on the Gulf below Tampa, and then retired to New Orleans, where he became a merchant, and then came and bought Mosside Plantation here in Baton Rouge. He's buried here. The Garrick family, I mean, it's just there's
Plenty.
hundreds and
to walk
hundreds
through
of them.
here is like a history of Baton Rouge.
Yes.
One of the things, there was a woman that lived, a young girl, a teenager that lived here in Baton Rouge when the Battle of Baton Rouge was taking place. And her name was Sarah Morgan. And she wrote that diary, so if you really want to know the history of Baton Rouge during the war, it's a great book to read. She is not buried here, but her father and her brothers, and she would talk about walking far away to go visit their graves. But her brothers, I know, fought in the Civil War, and it was actually a battle that took place where we are now, or near here, correct?
Yes, the Battle of Baton Rouge on August the 5th, 1862. The Confederates made an attempt to recapture Baton Rouge from the Federals, and it was fought. The main part of it was fought here in the cemetery. They approached from the east, and there were camps across 19th Street, federal camps, and the battle got very heated in here. As a matter of fact, at the end of the battle, one of the federal soldiers walking through the cemetery found, depending on the story, 7 to 12 dead Confederate soldiers behind the Crenshaw Monument, where they had attempted to run for protection. But at the end of the day, the Confederates had to withdraw because they didn't have any support, and the Union still had their gunships on the river.
And that leads us into the next cemetery that we want to talk about, because at the far, is it south, east, west? I'm not good with directions,
South.
but to the south of this, in an area that was part of the cemetery or part of the property at one time,
Right.
It became the Baton Rouge National Cemetery, and you'll notice it when you drive down because it's got a white, like, stucco fence around it with all the military headstones. But that started when, like 1866, after the war, as a result of a lot that were buried in this area, correct?
Actually,
Or early?
it was started by I want to say Connecticut regiment that began burying their dead over there, and they established a little small area as that regiment's cemetery. Well, in 1867, the federal government bought the property and began moving the federal soldiers from their individual graves and mass grave pits in this area over there. And that's where, like I said, when the American cemetery closed, they moved a lot of the military people over there also.
And some of the ones buried there in the very front actually go back to the Republic, the West Florida Republic.
Right. General Philemon
Correct title for
Thomas of
that.
the West Florida Republic
Thank you.
fame is buried there. And a lot of the
early.
Yeah, they moved a
military.
lot of the officers and their families.
Now that is no longer an open cemetery unless you have arrangements for
Right.
your
If
family
you've
already
made
in there.
arrangements to reserve a spot, then you'll be buried there. But for new burials, it's closed.
It is. You can walk through it, though. I mean, you can visit it during
yeah,
daylight
yeah.
hours. The gates are open. When I was doing the research on this, too, it said that within 3 years of the time it opened, they had something like 5,500 burials already in there. And they do have women, they have children because that are families of some of the military that are in there.
Right.
And so we do see other wars represented because it is a military cemetery, correct?
Right.
Originally, the walls around it were not. It may have been iron or wood. I know they came through later and did a brick one, and then like in 1939 they stuccoed the wall and painted it white. So it's very easy to recognize over here by Wood Street North.
Florida and 19th Street.
Not good with directions, but it's really a beautiful place. And then in the turn of the century, people would go and have picnics in there. I mean, that was a big thing for people in Baton Rouge to do.
Yes.
So it's a wonderful place to go visit, and quite different from the one we're in.
Yes, it's a little bit better maintained.
Just different.
And yeah, it's, you know, you come through here, you see the old above ground tombs and things like that. You go to the National Cemetery, and what you see are the white veterans' headstones.
The cemeteries that we're talking about today are strictly the ones that are located downtown Baton Rouge and are relatively close to each other. So we're going to talk now about the Jewish cemetery that's here in town. It's around 14th Street, and it's northwest of here.
Yeah.
And what are its origins? I heard it was after one of the yellow fever.
Yeah, it's actually in the 1400 block of North Street.
Okay.
And it's bounding it on the east side by the railroad tracks. The early Jewish community in Baton Rouge originally started meeting in members' homes, and they were able to buy the old Catholic school building.
Oh, yeah, St. Vincent's Academy,
St.
right?
Vincent's Academy
the precursor to
Street.
Catholic High, the old Catholic High School.
Yeah.
Original
And
Catholic
they
High.
built that as their first synagogue. They decided that they needed their own cemetery, so in 1858 they purchased one lot in that square where they're located now. Through the years, they have ended up buying the whole square and enlarged their cemetery. The original cemetery is very recognizable because it's still got the iron fence around it.
Okay.
The new part has a chain link fence around it. But it's another trip through the history of early Baton Rouge. You've got
That's true.
the Rosenfields there, Sternbergs,
Rubenstein's.
Rubenstein's there.
It's like retail Baton Rouge in the 30s and 40s. The
and,
Gottlieb family, I believe, is in there.
Gottlieb's, the Farnbachers, who used to have a big store at 7th and Main Street.
Tobias was
The
a
Tobias
businessman
family,
here in
yes,
town.
with local businessman. And, you know, like Magnolia, and you go through there and you're looking at early Baton Rouge history. So they, and it's still an active cemetery.
Yeah, that one is active. Another cemetery that's very close to this one that deserves recognition is Sweet Olive Cemetery. Sweet Olive was recognized as the first African-American cemetery in the city. Correct me if I'm wrong in these details. And we do know that some of the burials in there, although the headstones don't reflect it, could be slaves or slaves from families who have members buried there. But when did it get its start? Tell us a little bit about that cemetery.
Well, the sign on the fence over there says circa 1850. And I'm sure it was used prior to that.
Yes.
But it was originally established as a slave cemetery.
And it was part of whose property, too?
That was also part of Bueller's plantation.
Same one as this one,
yes.
because it's very close to here, yeah.
Yes, and but it was originally a slave cemetery, and through the years, it's still an active cemetery. There's still burials taking place over there. And through the years, obviously, it was used by the black community.
You know, we have some. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't
Go
mean to
ahead.
interrupt you. There are some notable African American religious leaders from here and around the city. You know, when we talk about holy people that are buried there. Washington Taylor, I believe is his name. Washington Taylor, pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church, and then Reverend Mitchell was from Shiloh Baptist Church. He's buried there, and there's I think his name was L. Shavers, or that was from the African Methodist Episcopal Church called Green's Chapel. They're all, you know, religious leaders that are buried in that cemetery that, you know, that we know of. I'm sure there's plenty more.
Yes.
This cemetery, like you said, is active. They've always made it a point, like in the late 1890s, it was owned by two of the benevolent societies from some of the churches here in town, the African Baptist, and there were a couple of them here that owned it and maintained it. so throughout the years, they've always made it a point to have space available for the poor. So it's one of these cemeteries where the tombs are very close together. In all of these cemeteries, they're all different, folks. So if you want to visit them, they all have a different look about them. This is one that the graves are very close together. There's a lot of people, buried in there.
There is, and probably will continue to be more. One of the notables that are buried over there is Ada Blunden.
Yes.
Ada and her husband went to great lengths to provide education to black children. And she was contacted by a former student who asked her to come to Baton Rouge. She did. She bought property on South Boulevard.
The couple did, right?
No, I think he had died, if I'm not mistaken. He was dead already. But she came, she bought property on South Boulevard, started a school there, and then ended up on Louisa Street, and ended up building an orphanage where black children were housed. And she worked, like I say, to educate the blacks in Baton Rouge until she died, and the black community honored her by burying her in Sweet Olive Cemetery.
Right, and she's the only white person, I think,
to my knowledge, she's the only white person
that's buried
there.
in there. And they did a plaque, an epitaph, which is too long.
Yeah.
I'd have to go find it to actually read it. But thanking her for her service to the community for 19 years of service, and she died in 1917.
Yeah.
But she and her husband were from New York originally, and they were missionaries. This is the work that they did, working with the African American communities. And so they did a lot for early education during Reconstruction, or right after Reconstruction here in the city of Baton Rouge from the Sweet Olive. The last cemetery that we're going to talk about here in downtown Baton Rouge, and of course it's kind of your baby, is St. Joseph Catholic Cemetery, because you're the sexton there. How long have you been actually involved with St. Joseph?
25 years.
Has it been?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So we talked a little bit in the beginning about how it had its origins, but tell us a little bit more about what you do and about the cemetery in general.
Okay. Well, it was when that lot was purchased, that spot was purchased. That was way outside the city limits, just like Magnolia is, and even the Jewish cemetery, because the city limits back in those days ended around 9th or 10th Street. So this was definitely out in the country, and everything went great. When they purchased the property, they purchased the western two arpents, which is from the main driveway to the railroad tracks.
Okay.
And that was in 1824. They didn't buy the second half of it till 1860, and they bought it at a sheriff's sale. The lady who lived next to the cemetery died, and they bought it from her estate and enlarged it. The first burials out of the old Spanish cemetery were along where the railroad tracks are now. And unfortunately, through the years, those grave sites have disappeared as people bought lots and things along that line. They buried on top of these original Spanish settlers. So, like I say, unfortunately, those original graves are gone.
Now, is it still an active cemetery?
No,
Okay.
It's classified as a closed historical cemetery. However, if a family member wishes to be buried with a parent or grandparents, and I can determine there's space in that plot, we do allow that burial.
Okay.
Otherwise, they have to bury somewhere else.
Now, is that the cemetery that has like the dollhouse
There is a
tomb in it? I
tomb
think it's
over
that one.
there, which was built in the shape of a dollhouse. A young child whose father owned a business on Main Street across from the cemetery wanted a dollhouse for Christmas. Unfortunately, she got sick and died very suddenly, so they designed her tomb in the shape of a dollhouse. She's no longer there. She's at Roselawn with the rest of the family, but the dollhouse remains.
Okay. I do know there's several priests that are buried there. There was a Father Heil. He actually worked and died at St. George, and St. George is our second oldest parish here in the city. It wasn't established till like 1908, and he died in the early 19-teens, like 1917,
1918.
Thank you. You know, see, he knows all those headstones.
Yeah.
When Father Weil died, he was buried with 5 other priests that are buried there that died from the yellow fever epidemic. And folks, that was such a killer back in the day. I mean, that and flu epidemics could wipe out so many people. But he's buried there, and you know, that's some of the faithful that, you know, I know. Those are the ones I know of there. But
yeah, the other ones were Jesuits who were assigned to the various schools in Baton Rouge and to St. Joseph's Church, and they were yellow fever victims. And they remained at St. Joseph's until 1984, when the Jesuits reinterred them at Spring Hill.
okay.
And there's a granite monument over there listing their names and the dates of death. But again, walking through St. Joseph's is a walk through early Baton Rouge history.
True.
You know, you go through and you look, and you know, you see these names that are familiar to you. You hear them on a daily basis in Baton Rouge. But the thing about St. Joseph's, when it originally was developed, it was for Catholics only. Well, through the years, they have buried Protestants there who married into a Catholic family.
One of the things I do know about St. Joseph also is that even from its inception, it didn't designate race.
No.
Black or white, it didn't matter from the beginning as long as you were Catholic back then. And there was some prominent families in the 1800s that were of African American descent. Some of them were free people of color before the Civil War, such as the Lang family. Very prominent business people. I know they're buried there. But I just wanted, I know we talked about, it caught my attention on that. That was the point I wanted to make.
A section of the Barranco family is buried there. And they were, you know, businessmen, dentists, things like that, professional people. And we, now in the early 1920s, there was a move to move all the remains from St. Joseph's to Roselawn, which was being developed. It never came through.
Right.
But like I say, it's administered by, I say, private cemetery board that has no connection to the parish.
Okay.
And they do the maintenance.
Chip, we're out of time. So I want to thank you for being my guest today. We could keep on talking about it. It's a little chilly out here right now, though. And folks, just if you're interested in these cemeteries, there is also a book that was written through Arcadia Press, and it was done by Faye Phillips on the cemeteries of Baton Rouge. And it's a great book. It's a lot of pictures of headstones, things in here. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Chip, for being my guest.
Pleasure.
And join us again for another episode of Roots of Faith.